Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Sonya Freeman Loftis. Dr. Sonya Freeman Loftis. Sonya Loftis is the M. Mitchell Chair of English at Morehouse College. Her work focuses on disability studies and early modern literature, and she has given particular attention to neurodiversity, autistic culture, and accessibility. She has an innovative forthcoming article titled Shakespeare is Autistic, and I'm very excited for this. I know it will further the field of Shakespearean studies, early modern studies, and Shakespearean disability studies considerably, just as her many other contributions have done. Among such many other contributions are her 5 books. She has authored 2 co-edited volumes, Inclusive Shakespeare's Identity, Pedagogy, Performance, published by Palgrave in 2023, and the wonderfully titled Shakespeare's Hamlet in an Era of Textual Exhaustion, which was published by Routledge in 2017. And in addition to these, she is the author of Shakespeare and Disability Studies, a book which, even though it was only published relatively recently by Oxford in 2021, has already left an impressive, really indelible mark on the field. I wanted to give a bit of attention to one of the books that evidences very clearly Dr. Loftis's impressive scholarly range. She is the author of Imagining Autism, Fiction and Stereotypes on the Spectrum, published by Indiana University Press in 2015, which carefully parses the layered relationship between representations of autism and autistic culture and disability identity politics to draw attention to autism's, quote, incredibly flexible alterity as a signifier of social and cognitive difference, end quote. Imagining Autism includes much more than this, but just to give an idea, it discusses Arthur Conan Doyle's autistic detective Sherlock Holmes, Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, Of Mice and Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Glass Menagerie, The Sound and the Fury, and Larson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. This first book on autism in these literary texts thus studies literary characters who reflect, quote, the full diversity of the autism spectrum, end quote, while recognizing the paradox that an attempt at representing this fully is what Dr. Loftis calls a nearly impossible task. She is also the author of Shakespeare's Surrogates, Rewriting Renaissance Drama, published by Palgrave in 2013, which attends to the adaptations and rewritings of early modern drama that themselves came to inform modern theater's primary aesthetic movements. Dr. Loftis's work has appeared in the Disability Studies Reader, Disability Studies Quarterly, Shakespeare Survey, and the Shakespeare Bulletin. In addition, she is the series editor for Edinburgh, Critical Studies in Early Modern Literature and Disability, as well as the Disability Studies editor for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature, and also the chief editor-in-chief of AUT, the Journal of Autistic Culture. Today, she will be giving the paper Hamlet and Macbeth in Crip Time. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Loftis.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to be here. And Jonathan is a very hard act to follow. So I shall do my best. This paper is entitled Hamlet and Macbeth in Crip Time, and the essay has an epigraph. Time is a topos. A topos is a common topic. That is, it's a concept shared by many and frequently mentioned but rarely defined. In its undefined form, a topos becomes part of the discursive machinery that hides the flow of difference. That's from Margaret Price's Crip Space-Time, Access, Failure, and Accountability in Academic Life. Hamlet is, in many ways, a play about madness and time, or more importantly, a play about madness in time. The play's emphasis on time, both at the level of plot, Hamlet is haunted by what has occurred in past time, and language, the play abounds with references to time and timekeeping, is a theme that directs attention to the ghost's call for revenge. In seeking his revenge, does Hamlet take too much time? This emphasis is also one which invites the audience to reflect on how appropriate or inappropriate Hamlet's various behaviors and actions may be. Specifically, readers and audiences are invited to judge what is appropriate or inappropriate based on timing and time. This emotional and moral link between time and the play's concern with appropriate or inappropriate action and emotion also strongly connects the play's exploration of time with its interrogation of Hamlet's potential madness. Throughout the play, Hamlet is angry at himself, not about what he hasn't done, but about what he hasn't done yet. Meanwhile, the other characters are first frustrated with and later frightened by Hamlet, not only because of what he does, but also because of what he continues to do. The fundamental problem of the play, therefore, is not one of action or inaction, but one of action in relation to time. Recent theorists in disability studies have explored the connections between neurodivergence and time, positing that mental disability exists in what is known as Crip time. Many neurodivergent people experience and relate to time differently from neurotypical people. Indeed, this very sense of differing or disjointed time is fundamental to some neurodivergent experiences. In this essay, I'll consider potential readings of both Hamlet and Macbeth through the lens of Crip time. While Hamlet plumbs the unstable and variable nature of time in relation to grief, trauma, and disability, it explores and then eventually rejects the possibilities of Crip time. Shakespeare constructs the play so that any reading of Hamlet, both of Hamlet's actions and of the play's events, inevitably depends on an agreed-upon neurotypical judgment of time, a normative framework to which both audiences and the play's mad protagonist must ultimately submit. Meanwhile, a reading of Crip time in Macbeth offers a vision of neurotypicality's potential fragility, porousness, and ultimately impossibility. The terms neurodivergent and neurotypical both originally arise from discourse in autistic communities. As Nick Walker defines in Neuroqueer Heresies, neurodiversity is fundamentally the idea that variation in human minds is a normal part of human diversity, and that a difference in minds is not necessarily a matter of pathology. Under such an interpretive framework, a neurotypical person is someone whose brain follows the typical neurological configuration, and a neurodivergent person is one whose brain differs from the typical neurological configuration. Neurodivergence can include a wide variety of mental differences, autism, ADHD, bipolar disability, that are not neurotypical. With the advent of early modern neurodiversity studies as a critical field, new attention has been paid to Shakespeare's mad characters, as scholars begin to read them through modern understandings of neurodivergence. Recent books like Shakespeare and Disability Studies and Shakespeare and Neurodiversity center that which is neurodivergent in Shakespeare studies. Articles and books by scholars such as Marty Philippian, Laura Seymour, Bradley J. Irish, Alice Equestri, Wes Folkreth, Nick Helms, Olivia Henderson, Melinda Marks, Bridget Bartlett, Avi Mendelsohn, and Leslie Dunn, among others, have begun to build a sizable body of work focusing on neurodivergence in Shakespeare studies and in early modern literature more broadly. Any reading of neurodivergence in Shakespeare's work would first need to acknowledge the frequent presence of mental disability in his canon. Neurodivergence, broadly construed, might not only include his mad characters, Macbeth, Hamlet, Ophelia, Lear, but also any number of characters labeled as natural or foolish, Dogberry, Touchstone, Bottom, as well as characters who may experience addiction. Think of Shakespeare's many characters who are given to excessive drink, such as Falstaff and Toby Belch. Indeed, any character out of his humor, so to speak, might be experiencing a state akin to modern conceptions of mental difference or disability. Neurodivergence and mental disability aren't synonymous, of course. Some neurodivergent people do not self-identify as disabled. Furthermore, neither neurodivergence nor mental disability, which are both modern concepts, map perfectly onto early modern characters. However, modern conceptions of mental difference need not match early modern ones in order for modern readers and audience members to recognize that many of Shakespeare's mad characters and natural fools experience a mental state that falls outside of current understandings of the neurotypical. This section is titled Defining and Judging Disability in Time. Although many people like to think of time as a stable entity, able-bodied and neurotypical conceptions of time are sometimes an illusion of sameness. People tend to falsely assume that everyone will be able to use and experience time in the same ways. Crip time is theorized as the way in which disability interfaces with or affects the perception or use of time. In many cases, living in crip time means taking more time. For example, a student with a learning disability might need more time to take an exam, or a person with a mobility impairment might need more time to cross the street. However, some people can also experience crip time as acceleration. For example, an autistic person who reads very quickly, or a person with bipolar disability whose moods shift rapidly, or even in differing ways that are neither faster nor slower than the supposed norm, but rather a differing perception of the flow of time altogether. Indeed, neurodivergent people and their families and caregivers have long noted that the experience of crip time seems especially complicated and variable in relation to neurodivergence. And disability theorists such as Alison Kafer and Ellen Samuels have specifically theorized crip time as an experience that separates the temporal experiences of the neurotypical and the neurodivergent. Crip time as a concept only exists in opposition to a perceived normative, aka able-bodied and neurotypical, conception of time. What it is, how it flows, what the able-bodied and neurotypical majority should or should not be able to do or accomplish or feel in a certain time span. Although people do not always recognize it as such, time is a defining concept in the field of disability studies. This is because disability is often defined and labeled by time in ways that the able-bodied norm all too frequently ignores. Indeed, it is important to notice that crip time as a theoretical concept is fundamentally an act of reclaiming on the part of the disability rights movement. Time as a concept has long been wielded as an oppressive weapon against people with disabilities. In fact, able-bodied and neurotypical conceptions of time are frequently used to police the boundaries of what disability is. Some definitions of impairment focus on what one can or cannot do, and sometimes on how quickly one can or cannot do it. In such definitions, a certain boundary is set based on time. For example, someone who takes a specified amount of time to walk a certain distance may qualify for an accessible parking permit, or someone who expends a large amount of time in self-care tasks, like bathing, dressing, and eating, might qualify for a personal care assistant. In situations like these, disability services and accommodations are allocated based on normative conceptions of time. In other situations, disability itself is labeled or defined based on time. For example, developmental disabilities, such as autism, are defined as a deviation from a set of childhood milestones. A child who does not talk on time or engage in pretend play at the expected age, or who has an interest that is regarded as age inappropriate, may be labeled as disabled based on neurotypical judgments about what behavior is appropriate or inappropriate at a certain age. How does one know if someone with bipolar disability is having rapid mood swings? The definition of what counts as a rapid or too rapid change in emotion is measured in relation to neurotypical time. How does one know if someone has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? One's attention span and activity level are measured in relation to neurotypical time. In other words, the boundaries of what counts as disability is defined in relation to able-bodied neurotypical time, and those able-bodied neurotypical conceptions of time are used to measure almost everything, from mobility to self-care, from childhood milestones to emotional appropriateness, from attention span to activity level. Unfortunately, comparisons between crip time and the able-bodied neurotypical norm often become a source of moral judgment, even when nothing moral or ethical is, in fact, involved. Able-bodied neurotypical time is socially coded as right, appropriate, and successful. On the other hand, disabled time, crip time, is always judged as either too slow or too fast. More importantly, those acts or emotions that are either too slow or too fast, particularly in neurodivergent people, also tend to accrue a moral judgment from the neurotypical world. That which is too slow is coded as failure, or stereotyped as childlike, or seen as a deviation from normal human development. That which is too fast is coded as impatient, or careless, or even freakish. When one's emotional response doesn't match the neurotypical timeline, then one is in danger of being called callous or unempathetic, or at the opposite end of the emotional spectrum, hypersensitive, or even volatile. Indeed, the social context, so often the force that people with various kinds of mental disabilities are perceived to be out of sync with, is partly a matter of time and timing. social behavior and interaction may be seen as appropriate or inappropriate based on context, which is partly created by one's suitable timing or lack thereof. Thus, in social conceptions of disability, time and the way one behaves in time becomes a subject of moral judgment. This section is titled, "The Time is Out of Joint." Hamlet has problems with time. Indeed, Hamlet's use of time is a constant source of neurotypical judgment, not just among the characters in the play, but also from generations of readers who have wondered about the so-called delay involved in his hesitation to commit murder. Even from the play's opening scenes, the other characters confront Hamlet with the perceived inappropriateness of his timing, specifically issues relating to the appropriate emotion to express and the appropriate action to take in relation to the social context. Crip time impinges on the world of the play in multiple ways. Hamlet is a play not only about madness, but also about grief. Trauma inevitably moves one's experience of events from Crip time, and one could argue that Hamlet's situation at the beginning of the play is indeed traumatizing. Although Claudius tells us that the death of Hamlet's father is recent, it isn't clear how recent. Though yet of Hamlet, our dear brother's death, the memory be green. Hamlet himself seems a bit confused about how long his father has been dead. In his first soliloquy, the timeline seems to shift. The exact date of his father's passing, mired in the uncertainty and imperfection of memory, obscured by grief. Indeed, the first reference to the time of his father's death is a contradiction in terms, for his father is but 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2. In neurotypical time, either Hamlet's father has been dead for 2 months or he hasn't. Crip time is more malleable, and the Crip time of grief and trauma infinitely so. Trauma can create a looping of time in which one returns to the violence of the past through flashbacks in the present. Hamlet's focus on time continues throughout the soliloquy as he rails against his mother's marriage. Within a month, let me not think on it, frailty thy name is woman, a little month. Hamlet's focus on time and inability to accurately pin down the time of his father's death suggests the movement of time in relation to grieving and grief. Much of Hamlet's conflict with his parents is a disagreement about action in time. Hamlet believes that his mother moves too fast. The funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables. Specifically, he judges Gertrude for her action in time. She has remarried with wicked speed. In contrast, both his mother and his father feel that Hamlet moves too slowly. His mother feels that his grief is too long. Do not forever seek for thy noble father in the dust. His father, too, feels that Hamlet is too slow to take action, chiding his son for the length of time it has taken him to seek revenge, and telling him in Gertrude's closet that this visitation is but to whet thy almost blunted purpose. Both parents see Hamlet's actions as inappropriate and as indicating an inappropriate emotional response. His mother claims that Hamlet's connection to his father endures too long in its emotional intensity. On the other hand, his father implies that Hamlet's delay shows a lack of filial feeling toward him. In this paradox, Hamlet cannot possibly do the right thing. His mother argues that Hamlet's connection to his dead father has endured too long, while his father's ghost argues that the connection has not endured long enough, even going so far as to warn Hamlet against forgetfulness. Hamlet is accused of a maddening delay, a delay that may indicate madness, but also a delay that makes other characters angry in both situations. Hamlet's grief is seen as delayed, but so too is his plan for revenge. Throughout the play, Hamlet struggles against conceptions of neurotypical time that he has internalized. Hamlet is aware that he is moving out of sync with the other characters, and he also specifically recognizes that he is perceived as moving too slowly. He is frustrated that his emotions are perceived as inappropriate to the time. What's Hecuba to him or he to Hecuba that he should weep for her? What would he do had he the motive and the cue for passion that I have? He would drown the stage with tears and cleave the general ear with horrid speech. Yet I, a dull and muddy-mettled rascal, peak like John a dreams, impregnant of my cause, and can say nothing. Jealous of an actor, Hamlet is angry at himself because his emotional response does not seem to meet the demands of neurotypical time. He knows that he is meant to be seeking revenge, and feels that he is moving too slowly. Throughout the play, Hamlet is out of sync with the timeline dictated by his father, and Hamlet knows this. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. I do not know why yet I live to say this thing's to do, since I have cause and will and strength and means to do it. He feels accused by every occasion, bound to the neurotypical dictates of time by the earth itself. Examples gross as earth exhort me. This statement is both metaphorical and actual. He is disgusted both by the size, the grossness of the pressure against him, as well as by the sight of an army that dies, all too eager to take action quickly for a small plot of land. Hamlet feels as though the entire world is on a different timeline. The player king knows how to display the right emotion at the right time. Fortinbras and his army know how to take the right action at the right time. But how can their timing be right when it feels so wrong to Hamlet? His anger and frustration pit his own experience of time against that of the neurotypical social expectations that surround him. Internalized ableism tells Hamlet that his timing is morally wrong. The way he engages with time is socially coded as failure. Hamlet's use of time is condemned by his parents, by Hamlet himself, and also by readers. This trend is perhaps most evident in ongoing debates about Hamlet's age. We know how old Hamlet is. The gravedigger clearly tells us that he is 30 years old. However, this lack of ambiguity in the playtext has not stopped readers from conjecturing about Hamlet's age. This is in part because some readers regard Hamlet's behavior as inappropriate for a 30-year-old man. Perhaps there is no appropriate or inappropriate age at which to have a crisis of identity, to be in conflict with one's parents, to doubt the appropriateness of one's emotional response, or to be hesitant about what action to take next. Conceptions regarding the appropriate age for certain emotions or actions are often underpinned by both ableism and ageism. When Marcellus forebodingly notes that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, he implies that something is overdue or past its time. The ghost is a creature that appears out of time and also in the wrong time. According to all the rules of logic, it should not exist anymore in the realm of the living. It is a figment of the past that appears out of place in the present. Specifically, the existence of this rotten something is feared to have the ability to create madness. Horatio fears that the presence of the ghost might deprive your sovereignty of reason and draw you into madness. In this scene, the ghost's disruption of time is linked not only to madness, but also to moral judgment. While Horatio trusts that heaven will direct it, Marcellus immediately denies this benign possibility, saying, "Nay, if heaven won't direct it, one has to wonder what will. In the Christian world of the play, the alternatives are nothing short of damning." Thus, the ghost, the thing that is out of time, is directly connected with both madness and moral judgment. Hamlet, too, perceives the ghost as a creature out of time, and like Marcellus, sees this omen as encapsulating terrible danger for both the family and the realm. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Not only does Hamlet perceive that the time is somehow wrong, out of joint, could mean that the times Hamlet lives in are morally wrong, given the murder of his father, or perhaps unnatural, given the apparition he has just witnessed. But he also sees it as his job to set it right. It is worth noting that Hamlet's metaphor here is one of bodily disability. Time in the play has become like a dislocated limb, a body part that no longer connects according to the dictates of able-bodied norms. If the time is out of joint, what would it mean for the neurodivergent Hamlet to set it right for the neurotypical characters around him? Can he move the world to Crip time? Can Crip time ever be the right time? The power of compulsory able-bodiedness means that Crip time is usually read as wrong in one way or another. Shakespeare's play is not an exception to this rule, but rather ultimately bows to the dictates of neurotypical time. Readers and audiences have historically tended, at least in the matter of time and timing, to take the perspective of Hamlet's father rather than that of Hamlet himself. While readers might sympathize with Hamlet's grief and see Gertrude's remarriage as hasty, readers and critics have argued about the supposed delay in Hamlet's revenge for hundreds of years. If time is one of the primary cruxes of the play, one might see the entire series of tragic events in Hamlet in relation to Crip time, and therefore to neurotypical judgment. Although the play is often conceptualized, at least in broad strokes, as being about the conflict between being and not being, to be or not to be, life and death, to what base uses we may return Horatio, one might argue that the timing of it all is the central crux of the play. Hamlet is angry at himself because he sees himself as delaying, but he does eventually take revenge against his uncle. Critics have long noted that Hamlet also shows plenty of ability to take action, killing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, for example, not shriving time allowed. In relation to the question of being or not being, Hamlet does eventually choose not to be. It just takes him 5 acts to get there. The readiness is all. When we, as readers, agree that Hamlet delays, we adopt the perspective of the neurotypical characters in the play, rather than that of the mad Hamlet. Our reading of the plot depends on an agreed-upon neurotypical judgment of time. But why should Hamlet's father decide his timeline? Why should we as readers decide or judge it? A truly neurodiverse reading of Hamlet would allow for the mad character to take his time. This section is titled Macbeth in Crip, Space, and Time. One could argue that Macbeth is a study in neurodivergence. In fact, one would be hard-pressed to argue that any of its main characters qualify as neurotypical in any sense of the word. Macbeth's late-night visions, is this a dagger that I see before me, if considered hallucinatory rather than supernatural, are certainly not neurotypical. Sleepwalking isn't particularly neurotypical either, which easily rules out any claim that Lady Macbeth's mental state throughout the play consistently displays neurotypicality. In fact, insomnia is an extremely common neurodivergent phenomenon that manifests in many different conditions: autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, etc. While context suggests that the Macbeth's insomnia may be the manifestation of psychological guilt or a result of the witch's supernatural intervention, it does not make the experience of insomnia any less of a neurodivergent one. While it is easy enough to note the neurodivergent elements of the main character's mental experiences, it is also important to note the ways in which the supernatural in Macbeth becomes entangled with neurodivergence. Early on in the play, the witches are connected to the insomnia that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth will later experience, as manifested in their promise to torture a sailor. Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid, he shall live a man forbid. Weary 7 nights, 9 times 9, shall he dwindle, peak, and pine. The witches cause neurodivergence, apparently. One could also argue that they have a hand in the Macbeth's trauma. What would their prophecies influence on Macbeth's terrible life decisions? Whether it is supernatural influence or psychological guilt that causes the Macbeth's insomnia is, in this reading, a moot point. The witches have influence, and that influence causes a specifically neurodivergent effect, or at the very least, is strongly associated with one. Indeed, the strong focus on insomnia in Macbeth, the play's ability to draw the reader or audience member into a long series of scenes in which violence plays out under the dark cover of night, the sense of the play as one long nightmare, draws the reader or viewer into Macbeth's experience of neurodivergence. As the play unravels our individual sleeves of care, we're implicitly reminded of the fantasy of able-mindedness, of the belief that our own minds are somehow impenetrable and enduring, immune to injury, exhaustion, or age. Brains change over time as much as bodies do. Neurotypicality is in a constant state of fragility, since disability is the one identity category that anyone can enter at any point. In short, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have neurodivergent experiences in the play, and the witches have the power to potentially inspire or cause neurodivergent experiences, connecting the neurodivergent in the play to both the main characters and the supernatural, or perhaps even the divine. Arguably, the most famous passage about disability in Shakespeare appears in Macbeth. When asked about disability in Shakespeare, readers, audiences, and scholars are most likely to think about Richard III, and especially about his opening soliloquy. This focus on physical disability rather than mental disability is a common feature of early work in disability studies. Indeed, mental disability's relative exclusion from the early work of the disability rights movement is part of what inspired the need for the neurodiversity movement in the first place. Perhaps, if asked to think about mental disability in Shakespeare, many would think of Hamlet's deep depression and suicidal ideation in the to be or not to be sequence. But the most famous passage in Shakespeare that explicitly names neurodivergence might be Macbeth's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. Macbeth says, "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player, that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Of course, idiot in early modern terms could indicate someone with an intellectual or developmental disability. This image of the neurodivergent God telling the tale of life is complex, in part because it may suggest starkly different interpretive possibilities to neurodivergent readers than it does to neurotypical ones. There are many ways, of course, to interpret the passage in question, but it has been a very common reading to see the figure referenced as a god. As an autistic academic, I find the idea of this neurodivergent God figure both shocking and empowering. Whether a neurodivergent reader is telling a story that signifies nothing or not is partly a matter of audience or interlocutor. If a neurodivergent person is telling a story, it has meaning to them. The question is whether the neurotypical person hearing the story will have the ability to understand it. All too often, neurodivergent readers are assumed to speak without meaning. Unfortunately, they are actually more likely to speak without achieving successful communication with the neurotypical people around them. As disability studies scholar Margaret Price explains in Mad at School, to lack rhetoricity is to lack all basic freedoms and rights, including the freedom to express ourselves and the right to be listened to. Some readers, including the severely mentally retarded and mentally ill, are denied these basic freedoms and rights even by the most liberal measures. In other words, neurotypical people tend to assume the incompetence of neurodivergent people and not to listen to us. Our voices are all too often discounted or dismissed. Translating between autistic and neurotypical is definitely a particular skill set. As with translating in any form, it involves differences in body language, differences in intonation, differences in customs and underlying beliefs. More importantly, such moments of autistic neurotypical translation require that neurotypical people assume the competence of autistic people. All too often, the assumption of incompetence eliminates the possibility of true communication before it has even begun. The assumption that I have nothing to say, or that I will not be able to convey it clearly, or that my stimming is not a form of communication, or that my lack of eye contact might mean something, I promise it doesn't, are all assumptions that keep neurotypical people from understanding me clearly. As the autistic philosopher Damian Milton has pointed out, miscommunications between neurotypical people and autistic people go both ways. It isn't just that autistic people have a deficit in understanding when they attempt to communicate with neurotypical people. Neurotypical people also have a deficit in understanding when they attempt to communicate with us. If Macbeth is describing a neurodivergent God, what kind of story does the neurodivergent God tell? It isn't a story that makes sense to Macbeth, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a story that makes sense. Macbeth's accusation that life is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing does not necessarily indicate that a neurodivergent God's creation signifies nothing, but rather that there is a serious breakdown in communication between the neurodivergent divine and the neurotypical realm of the human. Imagining the challenge of understanding the divine as a failed translation from autistic to neurotypical suggests that, at least in this speech, life is the shadow of the neurodivergent divine. After all, only God, or maybe in this case, 3 prophetic witches, can see ahead to the last syllable of recorded time. The ability to see ahead to the end of time, in any case, seems more likely to be an attribute of supernatural beings than of human ones. It is also useful to think about the deity presented in Macbeth's speech as one who engages with the world in what Margaret Price describes as Crip space-time. Adding the dimension of space to the analysis of Crip time, Price theorizes that the experience of disability results in differing perceptions of space and time that alter the nature of reality itself. As Price explains, inhabiting Crip space-time goes beyond simply having a different point of view or different lived experience. Experiencing the material differences of life as part of a subaltern group, including the joys, the surprises, and the harms, constitutes a different reality. In the course of this discussion, Price analyzes the reaction of bafflement that disabled people often encounter in their interactions with able-bodied neurotypical people. I can testify, as I'm sure many autistic academics can, that my neurodivergence is absolutely met with neurotypical bafflement on a regular basis. The routine realities of my life, ranging from the need for a support person or a weighted shawl or a quiet room, to the struggle understanding and making myself understood during a conversation with a colleague in a crowded hallway, are often met with absolute perplexity. My neurotypical colleagues and I are simply living in different worlds and speaking very different languages. Imagining a God as inhabiting a different space, time, and reality than worshipers might seem to make sense of conceptions of spiritual worlds that do not align easily with human ones. The point is not that Macbeth is calling God neurodivergent, but rather that Shakespeare uses the metaphor of a failure of communication between neurotypical and neurodivergent as a metaphor for a failure of communication between human and divine. No one tells a story to no purpose whatsoever. Reading the passage through the lens of neurodiversity studies sidesteps Macbeth's potential nihilism and the blasphemy of describing God through ableist terms to focus on miscommunication and missed possibilities for understanding and meaning-making. Macbeth no longer believes in God's competency. He no longer regards God with communicative trust. The God in Macbeth is a figure of competency and power, whose competency and power is misunderstood, whose communication is misinterpreted to the point of erasure and silencing. Thus, Macbeth brings us to a higher truth, not the belief that life signifies nothing, or that man struts and frets only an hour, but rather to the reality that neurodiversity includes all of us, encompassing the entire spectrum of human thought and emotion, whether real or imagined, whether human or divine. From Macbeth and Lady Macbeth to the supernatural elements of the play, there is no neurotypical in the world of Macbeth. The play presents neurotypicality as an impossible fantasy. It is the fantasy of a mind that is whole and impenetrable and perfect in a way that no mind can be. There is no able-mindedness in the play, not even the mind of God. In Macbeth, Shakespeare imagines a world in which every aspect of the universe is on Crip time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonya. So I apologize if I have Hamlet on the brain. All the frenzy around the new adaptation with Paul Mescal, right? But I was thinking about loss and grief and mourning, right? That book and the adaptation around Shakespeare's loss of a child. And I was thinking about loss and grief and mourning in Hamlet and in Macbeth, and I was just it occurred to me, Freud's classic essay on mourning and melancholia. Melancholia then as this failure to resolve the withdrawal of the cathexis, right? And melancholy has obviously been very widely explored in the Shakespearean canon as well. Do you see mourning and non-neurotypical or neurodivergent Crip time as mutually exclusive? Is there overlap? I guess what role, if any, do you see mourning playing in the notions of time that you're describing in the plays?
I am actually co-authoring an essay right now with Allison Keller for an edited collection that has a section on both Hamlet and Hamnet. So your question is timely. I think that grief and trauma and mourning are kind of that uncanny space, because a lot of people who self-identify as neurotypical, who think of themselves as neurotypical, who live their whole life as neurotypical, suddenly find themselves dealing with an experience that aligns more with the neurodivergent, especially in experiences of time and emotional appropriateness and all of these other things. And grief is such a unique and individual thing, but neurodivergence is also a very unique and individual thing with an incredibly broad spectrum. And so, if anything, thinking about grief and trauma in relation to Crip time sort of loops back to this larger point that the neurotypical feels like the construct. If any neurotypical person experiencing grief is suddenly having an experience that aligns with neurodivergent experiences, it blurs the boundary. That is always a very blurry boundary, if in fact it is one, between disabled and able-bodied experiences. So I think it sort of loops back into that larger point that neurotypicality is a construct.
Thank
you. Thank you so much for that just phenomenal paper. It makes me think so much about all of these instances of timekeeping and failed time and clocks in texts like Falstaff, or I'm thinking too of Titus Andronicus and the way the text is continually punctuated by like failed moments of return, or the amount of years that Titus has kind of dedicated his body to Rome. But I actually have a question. So thank you so much for just making me think about that in a very new way. My question is about Lady Macbeth, and especially I learned so much from your talk, and so I'm still thinking through it. But I've been fascinated by that line that is more Nietzsche the divine than the physician, and especially how like the kind of diagnostic moments surrounding Lady Macbeth are also failed. Like the nurse is there, kind of interpreting and helping the doctor along, who is kind of removed for that. So I would just love to hear your thoughts about this time process, the authorial figure, the figures with authority that kind of fail throughout the play, and how that's reflected in Lady Macbeth's experience with time as well. Thank you.
I was teaching Webster's The Duchess of Malfi just a couple of weeks ago, and it has that same kind of blurring trouble of like, what is going on with Ferdinand? And do we see him as someone who is experiencing some sort of neurodivergence? Do we see him as someone who's experiencing something supernatural? And how in early modern times do we tell the difference between those two things, or can we, or are they related? And so clearly the characters in Macbeth can't decide whether Lady Macbeth needs supernatural intervention or medical intervention, and their diagnostic categories for the two are greatly overlapping. So I do think that's one of those moments where we're reminded that even though we use the term disability and we think about early modern disability studies, that their understandings of disability are still radically different from our own in lots of important ways. And I think that is one of those moments where we're reminded that for them, the supernatural and the medical are still mixed up together.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first is about the terminology that you use to do with, you use both madness and neurodivergence in your talk, and obviously both of those terms are very useful in their kind of significatory expansiveness. And I guess I'm interested in whether you also decide to, in some of your other work, retro-diagnose particular characters with particular mental disabilities that we now conceive of, and if you do that, is that useful? And also, do you find differences in the experiences of these different characters' experiences of Crip time in the works? And my second question, I was just thinking about the actual particularity of the play as the play form and the role that time plays when we go to see a piece of theatre. Like we are there for a particular amount of time, and so I think in a lot of plays, time is very pressing and at the forefront of what the characters are preoccupied with, because sometimes events are only occurring over 1 or 2 days. So I'm wondering, how does this Crip time that you speak of compare in other works that are not in play form?
So in response to the first question, yes, I have retroactively diagnosed characters. Yes, it is useful. Also, it is problematic. So both of those things at the same time. I wrote some about this in the introduction to Shakespeare in disability studies, both about why we should retroactively diagnose characters and also why we shouldn't. And I'm perfectly content to keep both of those things in tension with each other. I think that retroactively diagnosing characters can be empowering for modern readers and audience members and people with disabilities. And I also think doing it can be anachronistic when we don't do it carefully and thoughtfully. And I also think that it can be limiting to focus only on characters rather than onto larger, broader topics. Like disability is all around us, and access is all around us, and failures of access are all around us. And so because we don't want to think strictly in the medical model of disability, we want to think about disability as something that exists in many different forms and ways. And so thinking about it as being only in one person is always problematic. At the same time that I also want to diagnose literary characters. So both of those things. In response to the second question, remind me of the second question.
Oh, just about the particularity of the play and
the play and time. The trouble with Hamlet as a play, of course, is that it takes way too long to watch. If you're watching the whole thing, the whole extended thing that all the editors smushed together and decided was the play. And that, too, is a Crip time problem for people who can't sit there for the whole performance, right? And they've tried to solve that with, like, relaxed performances and all these other things. And many of Shakespeare's plays have problems with time. Othello, supposedly has double time and all of these things. In terms of looking outside of drama, I have always thought that making a giant timeline of Paradise Lost would be the most amazing and challenging and interesting class project. And also think about time in The Fairy Queen and how everything loops, and both of those have very interesting timelines. So in terms of thinking about Crip time, The Fairy Queen actually has lots going on. And Milton has more going on with Crip time than we might think. And there's a couple of new books on Milton and disability that are like coming out as we speak, just about. But I won't spoil anything that they have to say.
All right, thank you so much for that.